Good evening. My name is Deirdre Cross, and welcome to Historically Speaking, Black Reconstruction, a conversation among Eric Foner, Henry Louis Gates, and Kevin Young. Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History, Columbia University, and Henry Louis Gates, the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard, editors of the New Library of America volume of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, will join Kevin Young, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, in an insightful conversation about Du Bois's historic and remarkably contemporary text. Originally published in 1935, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is described as a sweeping magisterial work of rigorous analysis written with precision and powerful eloquence. It makes clear that the formerly enslaved, as they claimed their first freedom and then their citizenship, were pivotal actors in the Second American Revolution as soldiers, emancipators, workers, and legislators. This book provides a stunningly clear context for the conditions under which Black people embarked upon lives in an era of greater democracy. This program is offered in association with the museum's exhibition, Make Good the Promises, Reconstruction and Its Legacies, and is presented in conjunction with the Library of America. We offer special thanks to Max Rudin and Leslie Schwartz for their assistance. And now I turn the program over to Director Kevin Young.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with Professors Gates and Foner and to talk about one of the greats, W.B. Du Bois. We're here tonight to talk about Black Reconstruction, the volume, but also Reconstruction as an idea. And to kick us off, Professor Gates is going to read a portion of a text that I understand Du Bois was responding to, because we want to think about what brought Du Bois to write this book. So take it away, Professor.
Thank you, Kevin. It's good to be here, and it's great to be back with my co-editor and my friend, Eric Foner. Why would Du Bois, at the height of the Great Depression, remember this book's published in 1935, why, of all the subjects he could write about, why would he write about Reconstruction? Well, in 1929, the last year of the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, the year of the crash, a writer named Claude Bowers published his take on Reconstruction, and it was called The Tragic Era. And it's another history of Reconstruction as a form of so-called Negro rule, in which corrupt and morally degenerate, of course, African Americans demonstrated that they were unfit for freedom, much less for government. And this is the quote: "Freedom, it meant idleness and gathering in noisy groups in the streets. Soon they were living like rats in ruined houses, in miserable shacks under bridges built with refuse lumber, in the shelter of ravines and in caves in the banks of rivers. Freedom meant throwing aside all marital obligations, deserting wives and taking new ones, and in an indulgent and sexual promiscuity that soon took its toll in the victims of consumption and venereal disease. Jubilant and happy, the Negro who had his dog and a gun for hunting, Kevin, a few rags to cover his nakedness, and a dilapidated hovel in which to sleep, was in no mood to discuss work," unquote. Now, this book was published by Houghton Mifflin. It was a runaway bestseller, and it was a selection of the Literary Guild. The book went through 12 subsequent hardcover printings. And Anna Julia Cooper, the whole race was outraged by this book. But Anna Julia Cooper, whom you know is a great pioneering feminist, and by this time was the principal of the the famous M Street School in Washington, wrote to Du Bois, urging him to write about Reconstruction in a way that would forcibly respond not only to Bowers, but to the Dunning School. And Eric will tell us about the Dunning School of historians at Columbia. And she said, "Kevin, thou art the man to do it." And, you know, that's all it took for Du Bois, because Du Bois' ego is like as tall as Mount Kilimanjaro. And you know what's interesting too, before Eric reads, one of the biggest surprises, Eric and I made a 4-hour series for PBS on Reconstruction. And one of the biggest surprises to me was that 6 weeks before he was assassinated, celebrating the 100th anniversary of Du Bois' birth, Martin Luther King actually gave a speech about the significance of Black Reconstruction. And if it's okay, I want to read that too. Is that all right, Eric?
Sure.
To understand why his study of the Reconstruction, old school Black people would always say the Reconstruction. I like that. To understand why his study of the Reconstruction was a monumental achievement, Dr. King wrote, it's necessary to see it in context. White historians had for a century crudely distorted the Negro's role in the Reconstruction. It was a conscious and deliberate manipulation of history, and the stakes were high. The Reconstruction was a period in which Black men had a small measure of freedom of action. If, as white historians tell it, Negroes wallowed in corruption, opportunism, displayed spectacular stupidity, or wanton evil and ignorant, then their case was made. They would have proved that freedom was dangerous in the hands of inferior beings. One generation after another of Americans were assiduously taught these falsehoods, and the collective mind of America became poisoned with racism and stunted with myths. This is Martin Luther King 6 weeks before he would be assassinated, still talking about how important it is to the civil rights movement, right? This is 1968, to correct the misinterpretations, the racist aspersions that have been cast on our 12 minutes in the sun between 1865 and 1877.
Well, anyway, I'm happy to hear from you, Professor Foner. But if you could tell us sort of your take on Du Bois's take.
As Skip Gates pointed out here in reading from Bowers and then Martin Luther King Jr., people's attitudes about Reconstruction are part of the present, not just a historical, academic issue. The Dunning School, as we call it, which came out of Columbia University, where I taught for many years, named after William Dunning, my predecessor long ago as a scholar of Civil War era history. But the Dunning School, Bowers gave a lurid and popular, translation of the Dunning School. Their works were more scholarly, but basically it's the same thing, that Black people were just incapable and inherently incapable of taking part in democratic government, and that the result of giving Black men the right to vote during Reconstruction was an orgy of corruption, misgovernment, and the so-called horrors of Reconstruction were a lesson to the country. In other words, now Du Bois is writing in the 1930s when the stirrings of the civil rights movement are taking place, and this old view of Reconstruction became part of the defense of the segregated South. In other words, if Black people regain the right to vote, if Black people regain civil equality, access to education, etc., you're going to have a replay of these terrible things which supposedly happened in Reconstruction. So this book, Black Reconstruction, is about the present, when Du Bois writing, as well as about the past. Because he knew that you had, as King himself said, that you had to destroy the old mythology of Reconstruction if you were going to convince white America that African-American people deserved the basic rights of citizenship, which were written into the Constitution for them in Reconstruction, but then later abrogated by a conservative Supreme Court. So this is a case where history matters. It's not just an academic exercise. What people think about Reconstruction actually has a deep effect on the society they are living in.
Well put, and that's one of the things that we talk about a bit in Make Good the Promises, Reconstruction and Its Legacies, the exhibition and now book. And I'm really fascinated with the legacies section of that, which shows sort of that long tail, if you will, of Reconstruction. I wonder what it means to revisit Du Bois in 2021. How do we think about framing him right now?
Well, I think the going back and reading this book first for our PBS series on America after Reconstruction, and writing the book, the companion book, Stony the Road, and then thinking about this new edition of Black Reconstruction, I was struck by two things. The book, it's not so much what he said, his scholarship on what happened in Reconstruction. It's his critique of the scholarship about Reconstruction. You know, he says in the preface, he kind of apologizes, says he hasn't done any primary research. Well, it's the Great Depression, and what Jim Crow library is going to let him in anyway. You know, and Du Bois is too busy. He was too busy being fired by Walter White from the NAACP and being a professor at Atlanta U in order to, you know, do any primary research. But it's a poetic meditation, and you'll be interested in this, Kevin, because of the poetry of the language. It's a poetic meditation on the history of race and the history of anti-Black race. Listen to this. Suppose on some great day as you plod down Wall Street, you should see God sitting on the treasury steps in his glory with the thunders curved about him. Suppose on Michigan Avenue between the lakes and hills of stone and in the midst of hastening automobiles and jostling crowds, suddenly you see living and walking toward you the Christ with sorrow and sunshine in his face. Foolish talk? All of this you say, of course. And that is because no American now believes in his religion. Its facts are mere symbolism. Its revelation, vague generalities. Its ethics, a matter of carefully balanced game. But to most of the 4 million Black folk emancipated by civil war, God was real. They knew him. They had met him personally in many a wild orgy of religious frenzy, or in the black stillness of the night. His plan for them was clear. They were to suffer and be degraded, and then afterwards, by divine edict, raised to manhood and power. And so on January 1st, 1863, he made them free. The magnificent trumpet tones of Hebrew scripture, transmuted and oddly changed, became a strange new gospel. All that was beauty, all that was love, all that was truth, stood on the top of these mad moorings and sang with the stars. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. Now, what kind of history is that? That could be in the Northern Anthology of African American Poetry, man. You know, Du Bois was tripping, and he decided he was going to take this thing on and establish the fundamental humanity of the African American people, which is what the rollback to Reconstruction was designed to rob us all. To say that it was an aberration in the history of civilization, not only in American history, to give these Black men the right to vote. It was a blight on the history of this republic, and that they weren't ready, and that they were barely human as it was. And Du Bois has this one line saying, forgive him, but I write in a field devastated by passion and belief. Naturally, as a Negro, I cannot do this writing without believing in the essential humanity of Negroes. So that was his motivation, to address the Dunning School, but also to throw down about the status of Black people in the Republic and in the human community.
Well, Professor Foner, tell us more.
And to just pick up from, I was just going to say that it's important to read the entire title of this book. It's a long, long subtitle, Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. This is a story about democracy. Du Bois insisted on that. It's a story about how an interracial democracy was created for the first time in American history, in fact, probably for the first time in the history of the world, in the American South, the aftermath of the Civil War. And then it was destroyed by the end of the book, 1880, he ends. But that's why it's so relevant today. You know, we are, one of the lessons, unfortunately, of reading this book is that our democracy is much more fragile than many people may think. For a long time, you know, during the Cold War, when, you know, the propaganda in the United States, you know, we represent democracy, the Russians represent tyranny, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not very easy to say today we represent democracy. Our democracy is quite ill at the moment. We're coming up to the anniversary of last January 6th. We have states that are trying to take the right to vote away from as many people as they can. And this is a moment when our democracy is under attack. And it happened before. It happened before. Du Bois is trying to tell us both the great promise of Reconstruction and the overthrow of that democracy. So it's a story about Black people. The title, Black Reconstruction, it tells you that, but it's also a story about American society and American political institutions, everybody in this country.
And he's concerned to establish the agency, as we would say today, that of Black people in their own emancipation and in the winning of the Civil War. And he calls it the general strike. You know, Kevin, he's using a Marxian framework. Du Bois becomes a communist at the end of his life. But this is his first major Marxian, proto-Marxian analysis. The book opens, first chapter called The Black Worker, and the second one is called The White Worker. So he's not very subtle about it. And he says this general strike, which now historians take for common, was quite controversial, though they don't use that term. But it's generally thought that, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Emancipation Proclamation really freed, of the 3.9 million enslaved African Americans in 1860, according to the federal census, about 500,000 were able to gain their freedom because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the Confederate states. And if an enslaved person could get behind Union lines, then they would be free. But also something that we forget is that there were 200,000 Black men who fought in the U.S. colored troops and in the Navy, right, in the Civil War. Lincoln called them his Black warriors, as a matter of fact. Now, there were only 488,000 free Black people in the 1860 census. 222,000 lived in the North and 262,000 about lived in the South, right? So if you do the math, where did those 200,000 men come from? They couldn't have come from the free Black community because there weren't enough people. It turns out that I think Du Bois estimates 140,000, 150,000 of those 200,000 were formerly enslaved Black men, freed during the Civil War. And as soon as they get free, overwhelmingly illiterate, of course, and as soon as they're freed, what do? They join the Union Army and fight for the freedom of their families and their fellow African Americans. That's an amazing thing to think about.
Well, and tell us more about the general strike. That was one of my questions.
You know, Skip is the general strike, as Skip just said, is the most striking example of a theme running through the whole book, which is Black political agency, Black historical agency. Du Bois has to insist on that because you heard what was, and he's just an example of a whole literature, that the general portrait of Black people coming out of slavery was they were lazy, they were ignorant, they had no motivation, and therefore they were just manipulated by others. They were told how to vote by white carpetbaggers or scalawags, and they listened. Du Bois wants to get rid of that and say, no, Black people had their own ideas, their own aspirations. They formed political associations. They voted, as Skip said, in very large numbers as soon as they were able to vote. And that's one of the big themes of Black Reconstruction. And the general strike is, I'd say, well, general strike is a maybe not 100% accurate in that it sort of suggests a coordination among all these people, which maybe didn't exist. But it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for Black people taking the action which propels Lincoln and the North on the road to emancipation. Emancipation doesn't happen in one moment, even despite that poetic passage. Du Bois understands that it takes the whole Civil War to get rid of slavery, not just one moment or one proclamation. But it's Black pressure on the administration that is pushing people toward getting rid of slavery.
Look, he says that the Compromise of 1877, which is the Hazehilton Compromise that we all learned about in school, right? He says it created an alliance between white capitalist interests, Northern industrialists, and Southern planters. And he says former slaves and indeed all workers lost out. But the point is, Kevin, 750,000 Americans died during the Civil War, right? And within 12 years, it's all over. Within 12 years, this brief moment in the sun, as Du Bois calls it, as Eric so brilliantly puts it, the first experiment in the history of the world in a truly interracial democracy is defeated, is yanked away. And not only that, it takes a few more years for voter suppression. Now, when you talk about what's most relevant about understanding Reconstruction, it is the power of voter suppression. In 1867, Black men in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states get the right to vote because of one of the Reconstruction Acts. And 80% of them registered, Kevin, in the summer, I call it the first freedom summer, the summer of 1867. In 1868, 500,000 Black men cast their votes, presumably for Ulysses S. Grant, right? And Grant wins the Electoral College overwhelmingly, but he only won the popular vote by just over 300,000 votes. So in effect, you could say Black men elected the president of the United States for the first time. This drove a lot of people crazy. They never expected these former slaves, again, most of whom were illiterate, to really take themselves seriously as citizens, which they did with the urging of their wives and their sisters and through the agencies such as the church, et cetera, et cetera. And so this had to be taken away. Why? Because South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states. Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were almost majority Black states. This was like a mini Black republic, a nation within a nation, as Martin Delany put it. And it had to be obliterated. It couldn't be allowed to develop. So starting in 1890, with the Mississippi Plan, each former Confederate state rewrote their state constitution to disenfranchise Black men. Remember, only men could vote. And I'll tell you how effective it was. In 1898, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote in Louisiana, again, one of those majority Black states. By 1901, that number had been reduced precisely to 1,342. Whoa. Black men in the South got the right to vote before, because of the Reconstruction Acts, before the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men in the North the right to vote. Black men in the North only could vote until the 15th Amendment in 5 of the 6 New England states and in the state of New York, if you satisfied a $250 property requirement. So ironically, the overwhelming percentage of Black men got the right to vote in the South in the Confederacy before in the so-called free North. All of this, it was like the genie was out of the bottle, and the interests of the North and the interests of the South came together and said, I don't know why we killed each other over these Negroes, but we got to make this go away. And that's what they did. That's what they did. And they took control of the narrative, and it was the narrative. Brian Stevenson is eloquent about this. The North won the war, but the South won the narrative war. And the Black people lost the narrative war. And that is the battle that Du Bois was fighting in 1935.
Professor Foner, will you tell us more about the narrative war?
Yeah, well, that war continued all the way into the 20th century and down into the present. We're still fighting. I mean, where you have states now banning basically the discussion of racism from public school classrooms. You know, the reaction against the 1619 Project, the reaction against what is called critical race theory, although very few of those legislators know anything about critical race theory, which is a fairly obscure methodology in law schools rather than in 8th grade classrooms. You can be sure of that. But, you know, the Daughters of the Confederacy, many people have written about this lately, you know, launched a very effective campaign to promote what we call the lost cause. One of the things we forget is the lost cause was a glorification of the Confederacy, but it was more than that. It's also an attitude about slavery, that slavery was not very oppressive, that slavery may have been wrong in some ways, but it was required to civilize Black people who've been brought out of savage Africa, etc. And then it also had to do with Reconstruction. The Dunning School view was part of the lost cause. North had won the physical war, but then it under the competitiveness of Reconstruction and by mistakenly giving the right vote. So that political debate goes on. And Du Bois, of course, is not the one to challenge this. Black scholars were doing that for 20 years. The Journal of History, which was founded in 1916, has plenty of articles with a much more truthful view of Reconstruction than the main historical profession. But white professors didn't read the Journal of Negro History at that time, or very, very few did. There were hardly any, if any, Black history professors in the major universities. And so the voice of even Du Bois, the book was widely reviewed, but it didn't change the way this period was taught in the colleges and universities. So it's really only in the 1960s that a whole revisionist wave sweeps over the study of Reconstruction, and we begin to get a much more appreciative interpretation of what was attempted there.
Kevin, the Dunning School, quite poetically, has been subsumed by the Foner School.
Good.
Thank you, Skip.
I think I know the answer, but are some of the Confederate monuments we've seen being addressed and thought about, which I know come about far later, are those part of this narrative that we're talking about? And just to highlight for people, if you haven't been to the museum lately, in the make of the
Yeah, no, the monuments which are now coming down in some places, not by any means, were part of this. They were put up in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, and they were part of the glorification of a sort of white confederative of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. That's why, to my mind, it is important to take down some of those statues, at least, because they are public, especially those on public land. If you know, they are a statement about who really controls the politics of the states. They're not just about history. They're about, many of them were put up later on as a reaction against the civil rights era. You know, they are part of the public debate over how history should be understood.
Well, getting back to Du Bois for one moment, why does his voice sound so contemporary in this book? You know, I think it's one of the powerful things about it. Could you tell us about why his writing is so compelling, whether it speaks to us now and also at the time? And Professor Gates, you indicated by reading from some of it how poetic it is.
Well, because the issues that were fraught during Reconstruction have never been sufficiently resolved today. Who has the right to be a citizen? Who has the right to be an American? Who has the right to vote? Just take those three. What is an interracial democracy? How should an interracial democracy be constructed? Its rights protected? How should the rights of minorities be protected? Those are all issues crucial to Reconstruction. And one of the one of the reasons Reconstruction was rolled back was not only because of these state constitutional conventions starting in Mississippi in 1890, but because of a conservative Supreme Court that did its best to undo the potential ramifications of particularly the 14th Amendment and, well, obviously the 15th Amendment, but really the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, et cetera. The Black people, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It would take till 1965 for Black people to get as many rights as they had guaranteed by the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to get them restored. Because the Supreme Court in 1883, in the civil rights cases, it was called, declared it unconstitutional, among other things. And Douglas and Blanche K. Bruce and a lot of other leaders of the race met at a church in Washington as soon as that decision came down. And I call it was the funeral of the race. It was the funeral for Reconstruction. Douglas gave 2 speeches that week saying the Supreme Court was supposed to be above bias, above prejudice. These were, he thought of them in the speech almost as philosopher kings. And yet they were succumbing to racial bias and political pressure. And does that sound familiar? You know, I've just read Linda Greenhouse on what might happen with Roe v. Wade. Where is that coming from? It's coming from the fact that the court was politicized then, and unfortunately, the Roberts Court is politicized now. And as Justice Sotomayor said, will we be able to recover from the stench of the political subtext that is emanating from the Supreme Court right now?
Professor Foner?
Yeah, that's correct, of course. And the one trace, of course, the Civil Rights Division of 1880 that Skip mentioned, but there were a whole series of them where for years the Supreme Court whittled away at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I'm not going to, from Cruikshank to the civil rights cases, later on Williams v. Mississippi, Plessy v. Ferguson, of course, one everybody has heard of, but there are many more of these cases in a row where little by little 3 constitutional amendments that were added to the Constitution in Reconstruction in order to guarantee the basic rights of African Americans and indeed of all Americans, how they were basically abrogated. When apartheid ended in South Africa, they had to write a new constitution because the apartheid constitution. And the new Constitution of South Africa is one of the most progressive in the world. When that revolution took place in the United States, we didn't need a new constitution. There was no change in the Constitution except for the poll tax amendment as a result of the civil rights movement. What they needed was the Constitution that we have that was changed radically during Reconstruction to be enforced. And one of the lessons for the moment here exactly what Skip was talking about with the Supreme Court, that our Constitution is not self-enforcing. It requires power to enforce it, to make sure that it affects the lives of people. And when the Supreme Court goes down this conservative path of limiting all these rights, it can have very devastating effects. It certainly did in the Jim Crow South. And we may be right now in the midst of another such retreat from the recognition of constitutional rights, unfortunately.
That's why Reconstruction is important for us today, because its history is repeating itself. And history will repeat itself if we let it, and we can't let it. So we have to study Reconstruction to see how this great moment in the history of American democracy was smothered. And then not only smothered, but erased in the textbooks, erased in the history book, erased and mocked, denigrated. So it wasn't enough just to end Black power, as it were. It was, they had to undo the narrative about it. Just to say there was nothing good about it, it was all bad. It was an aberration in the history of democratic institutions and ideals. It was a very nasty thing, and it was part of the rise of white supremacy, the establishment of Jim Crow, the drawing of the color line, and an attempt to put Black people back in a form of neo-slavery and invisibility and citizenlessness, you know, to rob us of the perquisites of citizenship. And it took a long time to get them back. And we can't let that happen again. And all of these voter suppression laws that are emerging from Republican state legislatures should mobilize us into political action right now. Because if you think it can't happen, just read Du Bois. It can happen.
Well, I was going to ask about the composition of the book itself and the way that you, oh, I think Eric's speaking there. Eric, do you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
Well,
no, go ahead. Finish the question. Because
yeah, I was going to ask about the composition.
Yeah, you know, I think the book, the book itself as an artifact of history and a narrative is, you know, is a very important and impressive accomplishment. As Skip said, Du Bois in the 1930s was heavily influenced by Marxism, as many people were during the Great Depression, and he was adopting some Marxist language. He talks about a general strike. He talks about the government of South Carolina as a kind of dictatorship of labor, using Marx's definition of communism. Real Marxists said, no, that's not quite right, Du Bois. It's not a dictatorship of labor. It's a petty bourgeois government. But whatever one wants to do with that debate, he does do, which I think is a Marxian view, pushes him in this direction. He looks at the class structure of both North and South. It's called Black Reconstruction, but there's a lot of white people in there. He talks about the small farmers of the South. He talks about the white worker, as you said, in the North. And one of the tragedies of Reconstruction for Du Bois was that labor did not understand or did not see that it had a community of interest with Black labor. If there had been an alliance of white and Black laboring people, it might have counteracted the reactionary turn that Professor Gates told us about a little bit earlier. He talks about the group that he calls the abolition democracy, the radical Republicans, the white and Black abolitionists who kind of were the cutting edge of demands for emancipation during the Civil War and equal rights after the Civil War. This was, these were real proponents of democracy in the political system, people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and others. And again, that was a complete rejection of the historical interpretation of that time. Most historians saw these radicals and abolitionists as fanatics, as maniacs, as people who had brought about through their irresponsible agitation an unnecessary war. And by this time, historians were saying the Civil War didn't even need to happen. Slavery was going to die out anyway. And it was all a blundering generation. Du Bois said, no, this was necessary. He doesn't believe in warfare, but this was necessary to get rid of the institution of slavery. So it's a very broad-ranging view of American society at that moment, North and South, and all the different classes, the bourgeoisie in the North, the laboring classes, North and South. And the other point I'll make about how we put the book together is if you look at the footnotes, at the end of each chapter are footnotes Du Bois puts in. Many of them are to the school works. He takes, because they were scholarly works and they had genuine information in them, but they were within this context of racism. If you take away the racism and you just say, well, they established public school systems and they rebuilt the Southern economy and they did this, et cetera, the information is there. Du Bois was a matter of using information dug up by his opponents to make his own case, which refuted the argument of Dunning School. As he said, he didn't do the archival research himself. He couldn't very well be doing that in the 1930s, but he took from these other books material that bolster a different interpretation than they were putting forward.
And he picking up on what Eric just said about what Du Bois describes as the natural or rational interests of white workers, small farmers, that their natural allies were across the color line, but they couldn't make that leap. He talks about the wages of whiteness and the what he calls the American assumption. And the American assumption, Kevin, is, quote, the American assumption of wealth through thrift, that these working class white people thought they would have more in common with wealthy white people going up the vertical of whiteness, right, than they would moving horizontally across the color line with their class counterpart. One of the shocking things about thinking about the Civil War and the history of slavery is that in 1860, there were 393,967 slave owners in America. How many owned over 100 slaves? You know, we think of slavery in terms of Gone with the Wind and Rhett Butler and those big plantations, right? Only 2,341 people owned over 100 slaves, and only 22 owned over 500 slaves. You talk about the 1%. This was, you know, the birth of the 1%, much less than, frankly, than the 1% in terms of who had the concentrated wealth in the South. And yet people were willing to die to protect that way of life and willing to do anything, including putting on a white sheet and burning a cross and lynching Black women and men, rather than saying that the American assumption did not apply to them, that they were not going to go up the great escalator of the American economy without forging unity with Black workers across the color line. That is the wages of whiteness. And that is a really valuable lesson of Black Reconstruction, which applies to economic relations across the color line today.
Well, there's so much here that I want to ask about, and we have some questions from viewers. I wonder if we can answer the first one, which is, I believe we'll learn a lot from reading Black Reconstruction. What would you like readers to unlearn based on the information in this book? Some of this we've already talked about, but I love that idea of unlearning. What, if we had to pick one or two, what would you say?
You know, we have talked about the Dunning School. Let's put that aside. I think what you want to unlearn here is, number one, the mythology, the deepest mythology in this country, which is American exceptionalism. We are the exemplar to democracy for the whole world, that we are the last hope of man, as Lincoln said, or the empire of liberty, as Jefferson said. Whereas, in fact, this story of Reconstruction and its overthrow shows that we're no more committed to democracy than any other country. You know, we need to get away from that parochial view that everybody in the world should just be like us, and then everything will be fine. So, in other words, the book should inspire a certain humility among people about America, about our history, and about, you know, many of the versions of our history that we see in classrooms and everything. So, you know, there are specific things, but I think it's that general mindset that we might want to unlearn after reading Du Bois.
I would add to that, I think you put that beautifully, Eric. I would add that, Kevin, I was first introduced to this book sophomore year at Yale in a survey course of Afro-American history. Now, they did not ask 19-year-old kids to read 700 pages about Black Reconstruction, but he has a chapter that everybody should read. Every student in college should read. Every student studying history should read. It's called The Propaganda of History. And that's when he deconstructs the histories of Reconstruction that collectively comprise the Dunning School. So that you learn, you never use the word deconstruction, of course, but you learn implicitly by reading that history was not an objective thing, that there's not this videotape buried in some cave somewhere that, and if you just work hard enough and make your way through the thicket of records and the dust of the archives, you're going to find the way the story actually unfolded. That ideology plays a role in how history is taught, how history is reconstructed, how it's written. That history itself has a subtext. There is no such thing. There are better histories and more accurate histories, less accurate histories, but no one has a monopoly. No historical school or no historian has a monopoly on full 100% objectivity. That history is an act of writing. It is a discourse, and it can be analyzed for its pressures, its ideological flavors, and the larger cultural work that it's doing. It is a brilliant chapter. It's the most brilliant chapter in the book, as far as I'm concerned. And it's a model of close reading.
Right. I agree with that entirely. And, when I was teaching, I used to always assign that chapter, even if we weren't reading the whole book. If, historians, graduate students, etc., are used to creating historiographical schools, this is the Beardian historian, or this is a history from the bottom up historian, or whatever, different schools. But Du Bois in his bibliography divides historians, but in a different way. The first group, these authors believe the Negro to be subhuman and congenitally unfit for citizenship. That's a lot of historians. These authors select and use facts in order to prove that the South was right in Reconstruction and the Negro stupid. He goes down. Then there are historians who are fair or indifferent to the Negro. And he runs through, and some historians who are mostly monographic and gather useful facts, even though they put it in a racist framework. And then he lists the Negro historians, as he called them, some judicial, some eager, and even bitter in defense. Fair enough. But in other words, you've got to divide the historians not on the basis of what school of history, but what their attitude on race is and democracy. And if you have a whole bunch of historians who believe, quote unquote, the Negro to be subhuman, you're not going to get good history out of those books.
And to prove that the Negro is human and is capable of full citizenship and can be an active agent in thoughtful democracy, you had to destroy the narrative, putting the negative to all those different questions.
Well said. So we have another question, which is, how might Black Reconstruction influence public policy currently?
Well, I hope one of the reasons that Skip and I were happy to help Library of Congress produce this new edition of Black Reconstruction is precisely, as he said, that these issues are on our agenda today. Who is a citizen? Who should have the right to vote? How do you deal with domestic terrorism? Those are all Reconstruction questions. One would hope that reading the book will persuade people, and as Skip said before, of the necessity of standing up against the assault on democracy, which we are witnessing in our country right now. That if Du Bois were alive today, I think that's what we would be focusing on. It's a great danger to our country.
Well, how might this leads to our next question from the public? How might Du Bois respond to the lives of African Americans today? You perhaps answered it, Professor Foner, Professor Gates.
I think that Du Bois, the first thing that would strike Du Bois if he came back was the class gap within the race. we talk about the economic gap between the Black community and the white community, but there are 42 million African Americans, right? I mean, there are more African Americans than all the people in Canada. So many people, like you, Kevin, like me, like many of our friends, were able to take advantage, our parents or us, of affirmative action. And affirmative action, my mother used to say, the old colored middle class became the integrated middle class, right? It was able, from behind the walls of segregation, the middle class was able to cross over. And so we have the largest Black middle class and upper class we've ever had in history. But if you look at the percentage of children who live in poverty, it's shockingly high. And the rise in Black prosperity has not been matched by the diminishment in Black poverty, right? And so how are we going to address, how are we in the Black community going to address the class gap within the Black community? Now, we can't solve that ourselves. I'm not saying that Black millionaires or the Oprah and Robert Smith are supposed to liquidate their money and pass it around. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that the members of the Black Caucus and all our Black elected officials and Black intellectuals need to figure out how that we can change the curve of class within the Black community, so that the percentage of Black people in the middle class and then the upper middle class begins to look more like the curve of class in the white community. That, believe me, would take $1 zillion and a whole lot of time, but at least we need the analysis to begin to address that gap. It's almost as if the system, like a pressure cooker, decided that it was, when the system looked like it was going to blow up with the Black Panthers and Black Power, it let some of us in for a few years and then shut the door. And we have to figure out how to open that door again, or to shift metaphors, how to make class, affirmative action was a class escalator that my colleague Lonnie Guinier defined it. But then somebody, after Bakke, pressed the off button on the class escalator. How can we turn that switch back on again? That's the most pressing issue that I think Dubois, that's where he would start. And then he would say, how do we forge interest between people that the system is screwing who are white, people who the system is screwing who are brown, and people who the system is screwing who are Black? How can we get them to see that they have more in common with each other than they do with rich people in their own ethnic group? How can class trump race? That's what Du Bois would ask. Don't you think, Eric?
Well, yeah, as we said, especially as he grew older and older, the issue of class became more and more important to him. And the notion of having cross-class alliances with some others. Yeah, I think, and of course, Du Bois's general view, as you know, was that education was the way for people to get up the social ladder. But eventually he came to realize there were so many barriers that was not going to be the answer, even though Black education was certainly expanding during the course of his life. By the end of his life, he had left the United States and moved to Ghana, and that's where he died, right on the eve of the March on Washington of 1963. I well remember, I was there, and I well remember, I think it was Roy Wilkins actually who announced to the crowd that Dr. Du Bois had died, which was slightly ironic because Roy Wilkins and Du Bois didn't get along very well. So he was born in Reconstruction. He died on the eve of the March on Washington. His life spanned over 90 years, and almost every issue of importance to Black America was confronted in one way or another by Du Bois during the course of his long life.
And no commentator before Du Bois or after has ever written more majestically and poetically about what it means to be a hyphenated American than W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, he wrote to his publisher, said Kevin, you love this. He wrote to his publisher and said he needed a little more time. The book, had grown to gargantuan proportions from what it was commissioned to be. But he said, I need more time because while I have a draft, I need to put the literature in it. I need to put the poetry in it. And that's why I was struck by all these passages when he goes on these metaphorical flights of fancy. As Eric said, it wasn't that way, but boy, it sure sounds good,
Well, as we wrap up, Professor Foner, is there any final thought to conclude us on? You guys have said so many things that have helped me understand even further Reconstruction. I know our audience feels the same way, but I wonder if there's any last thoughts you have.
Well, no, my thought is more about Du Bois himself and, his long career and all the twists and turns and how, this country did not honor him in the way he ought to have been honored while he was alive. So that the publication of Black Reconstruction by the Library of America is a kind of recognition of the importance of that book and its place in a canon of American literary and historical writings. And that's one of the reasons it's important that it gives this book the attention and the recognition that in many ways Du Bois never got, even though he certainly deserved it.
Professor Gates?
There was only one Du Bois. There will only be one Du Bois. He was the man. Anna Julia Cooper was right. Thou art the man.
Well said. Well said. Well, we've learned so much. Thanks for showing us that literary side of Du Bois as well as the historical change-making side. Thank you so much to the public for our questions. Thank you, Professors Foner and Professor Gates. It's really a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Deirdre, and thanks everyone for making a wonderful night.
Thanks, my brother. Tell Lonnie we said hi.
I will. Bye, everyone.
Good night. Thanks, Deirdre. Bye, Eric.
Thanks for having us.